Our scripture reading this morning is from 2 Kings chapter 5, the first 14 verses. Now Naaman was a commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. Now bands from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel, and she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went out to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See, he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message, "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went out with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not the Abana and the Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters in Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, 'Wash and be cleansed'?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became like that of a young boy. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Speaking of young boys, one Sunday morning, the pastor noticed little Johnny staring up at a big plaque in the foyer of the church. Little Johnny had been staring at the plaque for quite a while. So the pastor walked over there, stood next to little Johnny and said, "Well, morning, son." "Morning, pastor," said little Johnny, without ever looking away from the plaque. He said, "Pastor, what is this?" And the pastor says, "Well, those are all the people who died in the service." And little Johnny sat there, the pastor stood there with him. A long moment of silence passed. And little Johnny said, "Pastor, was that the Saturday night service or the Sunday morning service?" I think I might have spoken to the state of preaching in that place. I'm not real sure. Anyway, I love a good story, always have. I remember when I was a little boy, my mother and both my grandmothers read stories to me. And then when I got old enough to read, my mother and my grandfather carried me to the library at least twice a week, all the time, where my love of a good story turned into a love of reading. I read all sorts of stories. I read stories about famous Americans. I read all the stories ever written by Edgar Allan Poe, James Thurber, and O. Henry. And from every story I ever read, at least every good story that I ever read, from every story, I learned something. Sometimes I read a story from which I learned only one thing, not to read anything by that guy again. But the point of a good story is we learn something. The story of Naaman and Elisha is a good story, maybe a great story, and one that we can learn something from. It has a lot to teach us, even when we break it down in smaller parts. I'll just cut off one chunk of the story of Naaman and Elisha this morning. And even it has more stuff in it than we can talk about in the time we have left this morning. Now Naaman, he was an arrogant guy. And think about it, he had every reason to be an arrogant guy. He was the head general, which was like the Joint Chiefs of Staff in our country. He was the head general for the king of Aram, which is now Syria. And no military move was made without his direction. Naaman had risen through the ranks to become the general of the army. He was a warrior of warriors at a time when almost all combat was hand to hand. He was respected, yes, you might say feared, everywhere he went. Only the king of Aram ever said no to this guy. And it was on this leader of men, this warrior of warriors, this military advisor to the king, this really big deal of a man, that leprosy and the curse thereof fell upon him. We don't know exactly what disease he had. Back in those days, they called about everything leprosy. From the disease we call leprosy now to the black mold we get on the walls in our basement, that was leprosy. But we don't really know what was wrong with him. But we do know that he had the skin disease kind of leprosy. And, well, it was disgraceful for a military man like him to have a disease like that. I mean, you know, there he was, leader of thousands upon 10,000s of men, great warrior. Great warriors fall in battle. They do not get some stinking skin disease. Well, it was disgraceful. He had to find a cure somehow. He just couldn't live with that leprosy. Then this slave girl that they had picked up in Israel and Judea were separate by now. Syria was up there. The Syrians and the Israelites have never gotten along. And there were times when one of them ruled over the other, and then the situation was reversed. And in the meantime, maybe they decided, couldn't figure out who was stronger, so they kind of left each other alone, but only a little bit. And they'd have a raid here and a raid there. And one of those raids, they picked up a slave and carried it back. Well, they picked up lots of slaves, you know. But one of them wound up in Naaman's house, working for his wife. And she told Naaman's wife that there was this prophet in Samaria who could cure leprosy. So his wife went to Naaman and told him. And Naaman went to the king and told him, you ever played that gossip game? You know, you tell somebody, you tell you down, and how it's different at the end. Well, somehow, when it went from the slave girl through the several passages there, it got to the king of Aram that the king of Israel was going to be the one who could heal Naaman. So the king of Israel, the king of Aram, wrote this letter to the king of Israel, said, I'm sending this guy over here that's important to me, and I want you to cure his leprosy. I really appreciate that. And he sent big money and clothes with him, you know, sent him over there. Boy, the king of Israel was all upset. He was no healer. He was no prophet. He did not know squat about healing any leprosy. So, he did what they did in those days. He grabbed his clothes and he tore them apart because he knew it was the end of him. He was in terrible shape. Grief and mourning, time to start now because the end is near. That was a bad thing. Well, you know, Elisha the prophet lived in Samaria. Samaria's on a mountain like Jerusalem. Well, from what we understand, Elisha, like Elijah, lived in a cave. So, but he was, you know how good prophets work, don't you? They got ears everywhere. They know everything that's going on. And Elisha had somebody in the king's court, apparently, because somebody ran out to Elisha's place, and told him that the king had ripped his clothes on account of he was not going to be able to cure the leprosy, and the king of Aram, he was going to go back and report that he'd been insulted and there was going to be a big war. And Elisha sent a note back with the messenger and says, look, send him over here. We can handle it. Don't worry. Well, the king was relieved, and he sent Naaman out there. Well, now, Naaman was a big deal. And when people envoys went from one kingdom to the other in those days, they went with a big entourage. And Naaman, being the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he had quite a company that traveled with him. I mean, they had trumpets and drummers and flags and banners. Looked just like something out of Hollywood. You know, that's the way they traveled. They made a big show when they were somebody, and Naaman was somebody. So they left the palace in Samaria, went out to Elisha's house. And you can just imagine, Elisha back in the cave there, looks out, sees this impressive thing going on out there in front of the house. And he is not one of those people that's impressed by stuff like that. He looked out there and he said, I'm not going out there. You go out there and tell him what to do. You tell him I said go down and jump in the Jordan River 7 times and he'll be fine. So the messenger went out. Said, okay. The boss says go down and jump in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be fine. Now talk about insulting. At least the king had seen him. This prophet wouldn't even come out of his cave to meet with the second most important man in all of the kingdom in Aram. He was really ticked now. What is he talking about? This is ridiculous. I'm not going jumping. You ever been to Israel? Most of the time, the Jordan River is a little muddy ditch, kind of like the Circassia River. That's the one I'm trying to think about. It's not much. When it rains or snows, and the snows melt on Mount Hermon up in Lebanon, the water comes down, the river floods over, it waters the, just kind of like the Nile in Egypt, only on a much smaller scale. But most of the time, there's nothing, no big deal about the Jordan. It just, it's a little ditch. It doesn't generally dry up, but it's not much. And man, they got like the Tennessee River and the Missouri River over there in Syria. Big, wide, water all the time, clear. You don't have to let the mud settle out of it to drink it. You just scoop some up and drink it. But why did I come all this way with all these people? I got all these people to feed and I got all this stuff to do. Spend all this money to come over here and meet with the prophet. And the prophet says, I'm not even coming out to see you. Go jump in the lake. Hold the jump in the lake, and 7 times. You can imagine how insulted he was. So he wouldn't go. But it's a good thing that all great leaders, well, you know how you can tell a great leader? A great leader surrounds himself or herself with great advisors. And Naaman, the great advisor to the king, was smart enough to surround himself with great advisors. And his advisors came to him and said, look, boss, I don't want to tell you how to do your business, but if he'd have told you to build a temple with your bare hands, by yourself, to his God, you would have done it, right? Yeah. If he'd have told you to go out and dam up the Jordan River and make a big lake that they could drink out of with your bare hands and by yourself, you'd have done that, wouldn't you? Oh, yeah. I'd have done anything he wanted me to just to get this leprosy off of me. And his servant looked at him and said, well, you could have done that. Why won't you go jump in the river 7 times? You came all this way. You spent all this money. What harm could there be? So, after showing his temper there a little bit, Naaman decided that what harm could there be? And he would, in fact, humble himself and jump in the Jordan River 7 times and see what happened. So they went down to the Jordan, and indeed he did. And look at what happened. The end of the 7th time, he was clean. Amazing. You know, what happened there was Naaman learned. If he'd have gone to the prophet Elisha, and Elisha had come out of the cave and waved his hand over that leprosy there and gone away, he would have thought that Elisha healed him. But since Elisha did not do that, Naaman learned that there is a God in Israel. He found out that the one true God in Israel can heal diseases. It wasn't the river that did it. It wasn't the prophet that did it. It was God who did it. And in that moment, if you read the rest of the story, like Paul Harvey used to say, if you read the rest of that story, you will find that Naaman, in that moment, became a believer in and follower of the one true God. All because he was able to do a little thing that God told him to do. You know, I'm sure there's something that we can learn from a story like that.